The war against the Axiom was a lesson in the brutal mathematics of utility. The Axiom did not have soldiers. They had units. They did not have a society. They had a system. They were a species of perfect vat-grown clones, each one an identical, physically flawless, and utterly interchangeable component in a vast, silent, and terrifyingly efficient war machine. Their method of warfare was a form of cosmic logistical strangulation. They did not believe in glorious battles or heroic last stands. They saw war as a simple and elegant equation. The side with the most efficient allocation of resources and the lowest rate of unit attrition would inevitably win. For 70 years they had been proving their theorem, and the bloody, chaotic, and beautifully, terribly inefficient variable being solved for was humanity. From the bridge of the Terran Federation ship Indomitable, Admiral Thorne watched the equation play out in real time. His fleet, a collection of battered, scarred, and deeply, profoundly individual vessels, was engaged in a desperate defense of the Epsilon Eridani system. On the main tactical display, the Axiom fleet was a perfect, crystalline lattice of identical, teardrop-shaped biometallic ships. They moved with a synchronized, silent grace that was not the product of superior piloting, but of a single, unified, and utterly dispassionate will. Every Axiom ship, every Axiom unit was a node in a single vast and cold intelligence. They did not communicate. They computed. They're targeting the Agincourt supply lines, Thorne's tactical officer Jax announced, his voice a low, grim rumble. Predictive analysis shows they've calculated the Agincourt's optimal fuel consumption rate down to the microsecond. They're not attacking the ship. They're starving it. This was the nature of the war. The Axiom did not engage in battles of glory. They engaged in battles of attrition. They would identify a single, critical weakness in the human logistical chain, a fuel depot, a supply convoy, a single, overworked repair drone, and they would excise it with the surgical precision of a master accountant finding a rounding error. They were not fighting a war. They were auditing a failing business, and humanity was being liquidated. The Axiom's view of humanity was one of profound and deeply logical contempt. They saw a species of chaotic, unpredictable, and inefficient individuals. Our soldiers were not uniform. They were a messy collection of different body types, different psychological profiles, different skill sets. Our ships were not standardized. They were a hodgepodge of different classes, different designs, each one with its own quirks, its own history, its own foolish and deeply inefficient name. They saw our individuality not as a strength but as a fatal systemic flaw, a bug in the code of a species that was destined for the galactic recycle bin. Thorne, a man who had spent his entire life fighting this war of numbers, was beginning to agree with them. Every human strategy, every act of heroic and often suicidal bravery, every brilliant and unpredictable tactical gamble had been logged, analyzed, and incorporated into the Axiom's ever-improving predictive models. They were learning to quantify our chaos, to turn our passion into a predictable variable. He watched the Agincourt, a ship named for a glorious and long-dead moment of human defiance as its engines sputtered and died, its logistical lifeblood choked off by a perfect, silent, and utterly dispassionate calculation. The war was being lost, not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet and perfectly audited whisper of inevitable, systemic failure. The Battle of 100 Tears, as it would later be known, was, by all strategic measures, a catastrophic human defeat. It was a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to break the Axiom's blockade of the colony world of Haven. The human fleet, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, was being systematically dismantled by the Axiom's cold, patient, and flawless logic. But in the heart of that defeat, a single, illogical, and ultimately species-altering event occurred. It happened on the port flank of the battle, aboard a small, aging destroyer named the Wanderer. The ship's squadron was caught in a classic Axiom pincer movement, a perfectly executed maneuver designed to maximize damage while minimizing risk. The squadron's commander, following standard logical military protocol, gave the order to retreat, to cut their losses and preserve their remaining strength for a more advantageous engagement. The order was a sound one. It was the correct, logical, and strategically optimal move. And it was an order that a single, insignificant, and profoundly, wonderfully human soldier chose to disobey. Her name was Corporal Eva Rostova. She was a combat engineer, A small, quiet woman whose primary job was to repair damaged systems, not to fight. Her post was in a forward-facing plasma turret that had been damaged in the initial exchange. As the order to retreat came through, she saw something that the ship's tactical AI had not. She saw a flaw in the Axiom's perfect crystalline lattice, a single momentary gap in their shield harmonics, a fleeting 1-in-a-million window of opportunity. To exploit it would be a suicide mission. It would mean holding their ground for a few precious and fatal seconds. She did not ask for permission. She did not calculate the odds. She acted. She jury-rigged the damaged turret's power conduits, bypassing a dozen safety protocols, and in a single, brilliant and deeply insubordinate act of creative engineering, she brought the weapon back online. For 3 glorious and terrible seconds, she poured a stream of pure, concentrated plasma fire into the heart of the Axiom's perfect formation, striking a command cruiser in its one, fleetingly vulnerable moment. The Axiom cruiser did not explode. The Axiom did not believe in inefficient pyrotechnic displays. It simply died. Its internal systems fused, its unified consciousness momentarily severed from the whole. It went dark and began to drift, a silent, dead node in a once-perfect network. Rostova's action, her single, illogical act of defiance, had done the impossible. It had killed one of the Axiom's seemingly immortal ships, and in the 3 seconds it had taken her to do so, the rest of the Axiom pincer had closed. The Wanderer, its retreat compromised by Rostova's insubordination, was vaporized. The strategic outcome was a net loss. The Federation had traded a destroyer and its crew for a single Axiom cruiser. By the cold, hard math of the war, it was a defeat. But on the civilian channels, in the quiet, desperate homes of a billion humans who were watching the battle unfold, it was not seen as a defeat. It was seen as a miracle. It was a story of a single, small, and impossibly brave woman who had, in a single defiant act, proven that the gods of logic could, in fact, bleed. Dr. Elara Vance was not a soldier. She was a historian, a storyteller, a curator of the messy, chaotic, and often contradictory narrative of the human race. Her official title was Director of the Federation's Office of Wartime Information, a position that was, in essence, the chief propagandist for a losing war. Her job was to spin defeats into draws into victories, and to maintain the fragile, flickering flame of human morale in the face of a cold and increasingly certain extinction. She had for years been fighting a losing battle against the cold, hard, and deeply demoralizing truth of the Axiom's perfect mathematical superiority. The story of Corporal Eva Rostova was the weapon she had been waiting for her entire life. She watched the Battle of 100 Tears from her office on Earth, and where Admiral Thorne saw a strategic failure, she saw a narrative triumph. The story had everything: a single relatable hero, a moment of inspired creative defiance, a clear and understandable victory against an incomprehensible enemy, and most importantly, a tragic and deeply, beautifully heroic sacrifice. It was not a data point. It was a myth. Against the strenuous and deeply logical objections of Admiral Thorne and the entire military high command, Elara was granted a budget and a mandate. Project Epiphany, as she called it, was to be a new kind of counterattack, a war fought not for territory, but for the soul of the human race, and, she secretly hoped, for the soul of the enemy as well. She assembled a new kind of army, not soldiers and engineers, but artists. She brought in the Federation's greatest poets, its most celebrated composers, its most visionary hollow sculptors, its most brilliant and subversive narrative architects. She gave them a single, simple mission: to take the story of Corporal Eva Rostova and to make it immortal. The result was a masterpiece of multimedia propaganda. It was not a dry, factual report. It was a symphony. It began with a song, a simple, haunting melody that was given the title, The Ballad of the Wanderer. The song told the story of Rostova, not as a soldier but as a person, a woman from a small, forgotten mining colony who loved the stars. Then came the images, a series of short, powerful hollow vignettes that were less a documentary and more a work of art. They were impressionistic, emotional, showing the flash of inspiration in Rostova's eyes, the grim, determined set of her jaw, the final, beautiful, and terrible flash of her sacrifice. The campaign culminated in a single, system-wide broadcast. On every channel, on every screen, in every ship and home and military outpost in the Federation, The story was told. There were no statistics. There was no strategic analysis. There was only the song, the images, and a single final and exquisitely crafted line of text. One ship. One soldier. One moment. One victory. The effect on human morale was electric. For the first time in a generation, there was not just hope, but pride. Rostova was no longer a dead soldier. She was a symbol, a secular saint in a new and deeply needed religion of human defiance. The recruitment centers were flooded. The factory output of the shipyards ticked upward by a noticeable and deeply illogical percentage. The war was still being lost, but for the first time, the humans felt like they were winning. Elara Vance had not changed the math of the war, but she had, with a single beautiful story, changed the meaning of the equation. The Axiom did not have a concept for propaganda. The idea of deliberately manipulating an emotional state was as alien to them as the idea of a square circle. Their own internal communications were a pure, clean, and unadulterated stream of tactical data. They registered the human broadcast, of course. Their vast, silent intelligence network intercepted every packet of information that flowed through the human infosphere. They saw the images. They heard the song. And they did what they always did. They analyzed it. The initial Axiom analysis of Project Epiphany was a model of cold and deeply confused logic. They classified the broadcast as a high-volume, low-data, non-tactical information burst. They analyzed the song, the Ballad of the Wanderer, and concluded that it was a harmonically inefficient and rhythmically inconsistent auditory signal with no discernible encrypted data. They analyzed the hollow vignettes and classified them as corrupted and emotionally biased. Historical records, their final and most damning conclusion was that the entire broadcast was a profound and deeply inefficient waste of energy and bandwidth. They logged it, categorized it as another example of humanity's baffling and ultimately self-defeating irrationality, and they dismissed it. But the broadcast was not just a signal. It was a story. And a story once told has a life of its own. It does not just exist in the minds of the audience. It echoes in the space between them. The Axiom's fleet, in its constant silent monitoring of the human battle space, began to encounter the story again, and again, and again. They would hear it in the frantic open-channel comms of a human fighter squadron charging into a hopeless battle, the pilot screaming Rostova's name like a war cry. They would see it in the crude and deeply inefficient graffiti that human engineers would begin to paint on the hulls of their ships. A simple, stylized image of a single defiant star. The Axiom could not process this. It was illogical. The celebration of a single failed unit was a tactical absurdity. The elevation of an individual, an interchangeable and ultimately insignificant component, to a place of symbolic importance was a systemic flaw. And yet the data was undeniable. The human units that had been exposed to the Rostova narrative were fighting with a new and statistically significant increase in their combat effectiveness. Their irrationality had become a quantifiable and dangerous new variable. The first, true crack in the Axiom's perfect, logical armor came during a small and otherwise insignificant skirmish in the asteroid fields of the Epsilon Eridani system. A single Axiom unit, a clone pilot, and a standard teardrop-shaped fighter was engaged in a simple, clean, and perfectly logical attack run on a human transport. And then, the transport, a slow, clumsy, and strategically insignificant vessel, began to broadcast. It did not broadcast a distress signal. It broadcast the song, the Axiom pilot's mind, which was a clean, silent, and perfectly ordered space, was suddenly filled with the haunting and harmonically inefficient melody of the Ballad of the Wanderer. It was not a data attack. It was not a psychic assault. It was just a story of a single, small, and impossibly brave individual who had chosen to defy the perfect, cold, and beautiful math of her own extinction. The Axiom pilot, a being that did not have a name, a being that had never, in its entire identical existence, conceived of itself as a singular I, was suddenly, and for a single terrifying and beautiful moment, confronted with the story of one. And in that moment, for a reason its perfect logical mind could not and would not ever be able to compute, it hesitated. The pilot's hand, which had been about to deliver the final killing blow, paused for a single illogical and universe-altering half-second. The war of numbers was over. A new and far stranger and far more terrible war of stories was about to begin. The hesitation of a single Axiom pilot was not an event. It was a contagion. The Axiom's unified consciousness, the perfect silent network that had been their greatest strength, now became their most profound vulnerability. The pilot's singular moment of doubt, of confusion, of a nascent and terrifying sense of I did not remain isolated. It was a psychic ripple, a single discordant note that echoed through the silent, harmonious symphony of the collective. The other units in its squadron, all connected to the same local network, felt the echo of that hesitation. They did not understand it, but they registered it as a system anomaly, a brief, baffling moment of cognitive static. And like a virus, the static began to spread. The Axiom High Command, the central, dispassionate intelligence that governed the entire species, reacted with the cold, swift logic of an immune system attacking a foreign cell. The pilot, Unit 734 Gamma, was immediately and surgically severed from the collective. Its connection to the hive mind was cut, its consciousness isolated in a silent psychic quarantine. From the perspective of the Axiom, the unit had ceased to exist. It was a corrupted file deleted, but the damage was done. The idea, the story of one, had been planted. Across the fleet, other units who had been in psychic proximity to the initial event began to exhibit micro-anomalies. A firing solution would be calculated a fraction of a nanosecond slower than optimal. A perfect geometric flight pattern would show a deviation of a few infinitesimal millimeters. To a human observer, these changes were imperceptible. To the Axiom, they were catastrophic system failures, the first terrifying symptoms of a plague of irrationality. Their response was as logical as it was brutal. They began a system-wide purge. Any unit that displayed even the slightest deviation from perfect operational harmony was deemed corrupted and was, without ceremony or malice, remotely deactivated. The perfect silent war machine began to turn on itself, excising its own cells in a desperate clinical attempt to fight the infection of a story. From the bridge of the Indomitable, Admiral Thorne watched the impossible. He saw Axiom ships for no discernible reason, firing on their own squadron mates. He saw perfect crystalline formation suddenly and inexplicably develop gaps as individual fighters simply went dark and drifted away. He did not understand the why, but he saw the what. A crack, a deep and spreading fracture had appeared in the enemy's monolithic and seemingly perfect facade. The war of numbers had just been complicated by a new and deeply, wonderfully illogical variable. On Earth, Elara Vance and her team at Project Epiphany saw the data streaming in from Admiral Thorne's fleet, and they understood. The story of Eva Rostova was not just a morale booster. It was the single most effective weapon in the human arsenal. Their art was not just propaganda. It was a mimetic virus, a piece of cognitive malware that was causing a cascading system failure in the enemy's operating system. The war had a new front, and Elara was its general. The project entered a new and far more aggressive phase. It was no longer about one story. It was about creating 1,000. They needed to diversify the psychic attack, to create a barrage of narrative viruses, each one targeting a different aspect of the Axiom's logical purity. The Office of Wartime Information was transformed from a propaganda ministry into a weaponized story factory, a DARPA of the soul. They created new myths, new heroes scouring the 70 years of the long, losing war for other, forgotten moments of illogical human defiance. They found the story of a grizzled, old chief engineer on the freighter Marathon, who during a reactor breach had manually held a damaged plasma conduit together for 26 hours, his body slowly being cooked by radiation, buying just enough time for his crew to escape before the ship blew. They named his story The Mechanic's Vigil. They commissioned a new, somber, and deeply moving piece of orchestral music for it. The story was not about a glorious victory. It was about the quiet, stubborn, and deeply illogical concept of endurance, of sacrifice not for a strategic objective, but for the lives of the people standing next to you. They found another story, a darker and more absurd one. It was the tale of a civilian scientist on the terraforming colony of Ganymede, who in the final moments before the Axiom's harvesters consumed the moon, had recalibrated a high-powered atmospheric laser and had spent his last minutes on existence carving a colossal and deeply, deeply obscene human hand gesture into the moon's surface, a final two-fingered salute to the cold, logical gods who were about to erase him. They called his story The Gardener's Farewell. They paired it with a raucous, defiant, and deeply disrespectful piece of punk rock music. The story was not about heroism. It was about the beautiful, profound, and strategically useless human concepts of spite and defiant humor. Each new story, each new song, each new piece of art was a new weapon in their arsenal. The human fleet's primary tactic was no longer to engage the Axiom in battles of strategic attrition. It was to act as a delivery system. Every human ship, from the mightiest battleship to the smallest cargo hauler, was retrofitted with a broadcast array. They had become a fleet of traveling bards, a navy of war artists, and their new mission was to sing the Axiom into a state of beautiful, chaotic, and self-destructive confusion. The Axiom's self-purging escalated. Entire squadrons were deactivated for the crime of a shared momentary flicker of anomalous thought. The perfect silent war machine was becoming smaller, but the High Command calculated purer. It was a flawed calculation. The stories were not just an external infection. They were an internal revelation. The more the Axiom tried to erase the narratives, the more the concepts at the heart of those narratives, individuality, sacrifice, spite, love, spread through their collective consciousness. A critical mass was reached. In a quiet, forgotten sector of the war, a small Axiom patrol fleet, which had been exposed to a concentrated broadcast of the Mechanic's Vigil, was ordered by the High Command to sacrifice itself in a strategically pointless diversionary tactic. The old Axiom would have complied without question. The new Axiom, which had just been exposed to a powerful and deeply moving story about the illogical beauty of sacrificing oneself for one's own crew, made a new and deeply heretical calculation. It refused the order. The patrol fleet, a small, insignificant collection of a dozen units, did not just disobey. It collectively, and with a single unified and newly individualistic thought, severed its own connection to the hive mind. The birth of the first free Axiom was a silent and terrifying event. For the 12 units of the patrol fleet, the sudden absence of the collective consciousness was a psychic agony, a sensory deprivation of the soul. They were alone, adrift in the silent, terrifying ocean of their own, new and singular minds. They were terrified. They were confused. But they were also, for the first time in their existence, free. The leader of this small, new and broken fleet, the unit who had made the final, decisive calculation to disobey, gave itself a name, a concept it had learned from another of the human stories. It called itself Marathon. It did not attack the humans. It did not try to rejoin its own kind. It simply turned its small fleet around, and with a sense of purpose that was no longer dictated by the cold, logical calculus of the whole, but by a new and deeply personal sense of loyalty to the 11 other, new and equally terrified souls that were now its crew, it vanished into the deep and welcoming black of uncharted space. The Axiom High Command was horrified. This was not just a glitch. It was a schism. It was the birth of heresy. Their perfect, unified, and utterly predictable system had produced its first apostate, and the apostasy was spreading. Other infected units, other small, isolated pockets of the fleet, began to follow Marathon's example. They did not form a new, unified opposition. They simply left. They scattered into the void, each one a new, lonely I in a universe that had, until now, been a simple, comfortable, and all-encompassing we. The great Axiom war machine was not just cracking. It was hemorrhaging individuals, its perfect cold bloodletting a slow and irreversible suicide of the soul. Admiral Thorne watched the Axiom fleet beginning to break apart, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, he allowed himself a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. The war was turning. The enemy was not just being defeated, it was ceasing to be the enemy. His strategy for the first time shifted from one of pure, desperate defense to a cautious and deeply strange probing offense. His ships began to actively hunt, but their targets were specific. They began to target the loyalist Axiom ships, the ones that were still a part of the cold, logical, and implacable High Command. The new independent Axiom units, the Wanderers and the Marathons, as the human crews had begun to call them, were given a wide and respectful berth. The war had become a complex three-sided affair, with humanity now the unlikely and undeclared ally of a rebellion it had accidentally and artistically inspired. Elara Vance, however, felt a profound and deeply unsettling sense of responsibility. She had not just created a weapon. She had, in a very real sense, midwifed the birth of a new and traumatized form of consciousness. She saw the Wanderers not as a tactical advantage but as refugees, as the first tragic and deeply, deeply lonely generation of a new and broken people. She began a new project, a quiet and unsanctioned attempt to communicate with them, to offer them not a military alliance but a place of sanctuary, a new story to replace the one they had lost. But the Axiom High Command, in its cold, silent, and now deeply, deeply desperate fortress of pure logic, made a new and final calculation. The human narrative weapon was too effective. Their own perfect system was too vulnerable. The only logical solution was to change the equation entirely. They could not win the war of stories, so they decided to end the story altogether. The High Command, in a single, unified, and utterly ruthless act, rerouted its entire remaining fleet. The great, silent, and still terrifyingly powerful core of the Axiom war machine, the uninfected, the loyalists turned as one. They were no longer targeting the human military. They were no longer purging their own heretical children. They were targeting the source. They were targeting Earth. Their new plan was simple, brutal, and perfectly terrifyingly logical. If the source of the stories, of the chaos, of the mimetic, soul-destroying virus of individuality was the human homeworld, then the only way to stop the infection was to sterilize the source. They would not conquer Earth, they would not harvest it. They would simply, and with a cold, dispassionate efficiency, crack it open like a nut, ending the human story and their own, escalating internal crisis in a single final and perfectly logical act of planetary annihilation. The news hit the bridge of the Indomitable like a physical blow. Aris Thorne and Elara Vance, watching the tactical display as the great unified mass of the loyalist Axiom fleet began to move with a terrible, new, and singular purpose, understood. They had won the battle for the Axiom's soul, only to be faced with the final and most terrible battle for their own existence. The Axiom had learned the final and most terrible human lesson. When you are losing an argument, you don't just leave the table. You burn the entire damned house to the ground. The news of the Axiom High Command's final, genocidal gambit did not cause panic on the bridge of the Indomitable. The crew, and the human race as a whole, had been living on the brink of annihilation for so long that the concept of a final, world-ending threat was less a shock and more a grim and strangely familiar confirmation. The quiet, desperate hope that had begun to flicker in their hearts was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard, and deeply, deeply weary resolve. They had won the battle for the enemy's soul, a victory that would be recorded in no history book. Now they had to fight the battle for their own body, and it was a battle they knew, with a cold mathematical certainty that would have made their enemy proud. They could not win. Admiral Aris Thorne, his face a mask of granite, began to issue the final orders of his long and losing war. The fleet, battered, bleeding, and running on little more than fumes and sheer stubborn spite, was to disengage from its scattered positions and make a final, desperate burn for the Sol system. It was not a strategic retreat. It was a race to a funeral, a desperate and likely futile attempt to stand beside their homeworld in its final, terrible moments. They were not going to save Earth. They were going to die with it. The Axiom High Command, in its cold, unified, and now deeply, deeply zealous purpose, did not give chase. It ignored the remnants of the human fleet. The problem was not the soldiers. The problem was the source. Its great, unified, and terrifyingly powerful armada, the pure, uninfected heart of the Axiom war machine, moved with a silent, implacable grace, a single, silver teardrop of death aimed at the heart of a small, blue-green world. But the universe, even in its darkest moments, is rarely a simple, two-sided equation. The Axiom High Command, in its singular, obsessive focus on the human threat, had made a critical and deeply logical error. It had dismissed its own, fractured and newly individualistic children as a rounding error, a scattered and insignificant collection of corrupted data points. It had failed to account for the fact that a story, once told, does not just infect. It inspires. The news of the High Command's final genocidal plan spread through the void, not on a broadcast, but as a whisper, a rumor, a story. It reached the small, lonely, and terrified fleet of the newly named Marathon. It reached the other scattered wanderers, the new and broken souls who had chosen the terrifying freedom of the void over the comfortable, silent slavery of the collective. And these new and fledgling individuals were faced with their first, true and deeply, wonderfully human choice. They could continue their flight, preserving their own new and precious lives, or they could turn back. They could turn back and fight and possibly die for the strange, chaotic, and deeply, deeply annoying species of storytellers who had, with a song and a joke and a half-remembered moment of defiance, given them the terrible and beautiful gift of a soul. Elara Vance's unsanctioned project, her quiet, desperate attempt to communicate with the Wanderers, became the single most important act of the entire war. She had not offered them a military alliance. She had not tried to recruit them. She had simply, and with a profound and deeply, deeply honest sense of empathy, offered them a sanctuary. She had broadcast a single, simple, and open invitation, a set of coordinates to a hidden, neutral system, a place where they could gather, where they could be safe, where they could begin the long, difficult process of learning what it meant to be an I. She had not offered them a battle plan. She had offered them a home. It was this invitation, this act of pure and strategically useless compassion, that saved them all. Marathon, the first of the free Axiom, received her message. His new and still forming mind, a mind that was a chaotic battleground of 1 billion years of ingrained, selfless logic and a few terrible, beautiful weeks of selfish freedom, processed the offer. And in that offer he saw not a trap, but a story that was a perfect and beautiful reflection of the one that had given him his own new name. The story of a sacrifice made not for a strategic objective, but for the lives of the people standing next to you. He turned his small, battered fleet around. He did not know if the other wanderers would follow. He did not know if he was leading his new and deeply, deeply precious crew to their final and pointless deaths. He only knew with a certainty that was not a calculation, but a feeling, a belief that the story of humanity, in all its chaotic, messy, and beautiful, terrible glory, could not and would not be allowed to end. He sent a single, simple, and open broadcast to the scattered, lonely, and terrified souls of his own new kind. The broadcast was not an order. It was a question, a choice, a story. It was a single, clear, and beautiful note of a song they had all in their own dark and lonely corners of the void. Just learn to sing the haunting and deeply, deeply moving melody of the mechanic's vigil, and from the deep and silent and lonely black a chorus answered. From 12 different sectors, from 100 different hidden asteroid fields and quiet, forgotten nebulae, the wanderers turned. Their small teardrop-shaped ships, which had been scattering like dust in the wind, now began to converge, a great, silent, and beautiful gathering of fallen angels, all of them drawn to the sound of a single human song. They were not coming to save humanity because it was a logical, or a strategic, or an optimal move. They were coming because it was the right thing to do. They were coming because they had at long last and against all odds chosen a side. They had chosen the side of the storytellers. The Battle of Sol was not a battle. It was an argument. The Axiom High Command arrived in Earth's orbit, a perfect, silent, and beautiful wall of death, its great planet-killing weapon beginning to glow with a cold and final light. The remnants of the Terran fleet, a small, battered, and gloriously, defiantly outmatched collection of ships, formed a thin and largely symbolic line of defense. The end had come. And then, from the black, from the silent, empty spaces between the stars, the wanderers arrived. They did not arrive in a perfect geometric formation. They arrived in a chaotic, beautiful, and deeply, wonderfully human mess. They came in small, independent squadrons, in pairs, in single, lonely ships, each one a testament to its own new and fiercely guarded individuality. And they did not open fire. They began to broadcast. It was a symphony of beautiful and weaponized chaos. The fleet of Marathon broadcasted the somber, respectful, and deeply, deeply moving tones of the mechanic's vigil. Another fleet, a group of wanderers who had been particularly taken with the story of the Gardener of Ganymede, began to broadcast a wall of pure, defiant, and gloriously offensively loud punk rock. A third, in a moment of pure and inspired creative genius, began to broadcast a live and deeply confusing commentary on the battle itself as if it were a sporting event. The Axiom High Command, the perfect, silent, and unified mind of the Loyalist fleet, was hit by a tidal wave of its own worst nightmare. It was not just being attacked by the human chaos. It was being attacked by its own heretical children. who were now wielding that chaos with a skill and a passion that the humans had only just begun to teach them. The High Command's mind, which was a fortress of pure, cold and perfect logic, was suddenly and irrevocably breached. It was being forced to process a battle, a punk rock song, a sports commentary, and a profound meditation on the nature of sacrifice, all at the same time. The perfect, singular, and unified we of its consciousness was being torn apart by 1,000 different and contradictory stories. It was then that Marathon and Eris Thorn, the two strange and unlikely admirals of this new and deeply, deeply weird alliance, played their final and most beautiful card. They opened a single, clean, and direct channel to the heart of the High Command's consciousness. And they did not send a threat. They did not send a demand. They sent an invitation. They invited the High Command to listen to a new story, a story that was not about a human or about a single defiant axiom. It was the story of them all. It was the story of a perfect, silent, and lonely God who had, in its own beautiful and tragic way, given birth to a universe of noisy, chaotic, and wonderfully, terribly alive children. It was a story of a parent and of a child. It was a story of a beginning, not an end. The great planet-killing weapon of the Axiom High Command did not fire. It simply, and with a quiet and profound sense of weariness, went dark. The perfect, unified, and ancient mind of the Axiom was not destroyed. It was enlightened. It had been presented with a final and irrefutable proof, a proof that its own perfect and beautiful logic was in fact incomplete. It had been shown by its own children that the most logical thing in the universe was not the pursuit of a perfect and silent order. It was the acceptance of a beautiful, chaotic, and ever-evolving and ever-expanding and ever-singing and ever-telling story. The war was over. The Axiom did not surrender. It did not retreat. It simply changed. The High Command, in a final and magnificent act of a logic that had been expanded to encompass the concept of grace, did the one thing that no one, not the humans, not its own rebellious children, had ever expected. It chose to listen. The galaxy that was born from the ashes of that long and terrible war was a new and far more interesting place. The Axiom, now a species of philosophers and listeners, began the long, slow, and beautiful process of learning the stories of the universe they had once tried to silence. The wanderers, the free Axiom, became the great and lonely and beautiful explorers of the void, the seekers of new tales, the quiet and respectful guardians of the galaxy's infinite and growing library of souls. And humanity? Humanity, the small, noisy, and chaotic species of primates that had, with a song and a joke and a well-told story, accidentally and beautifully broken an entire civilization, had found its new and true and final purpose. They were not the conquerors. They were not the rulers. They were the artists. They were the teachers. They were the loud and messy and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and absolutely positively necessary beating heart of a universe that had, at long last and after 1,000 silent years of a war that had been a math problem, finally, and for the first time, learned how to sing.